been a very strange 3 years because we traded for 40 years without ever making a loss, and then lost $250 million in the 3 following years. And we were quite lucky we were on the stock market, so we were able to raise money from investors. Others weren't so lucky. So it's been a terribly turbulent time. I would say the biggest surprise has been that people thought once people were released from lockdowns and restrictions, there'd be a boom, the cabin fever, people would go out.
They'd run back to the pub as soon as possible.
But it didn't happen. And I think a more powerful factor with human beings is habit. Once they stopped going to the pubs, going to Tesco to buy some beer from there, they stuck with it, and it's taken quite a while for them to get back.
And yet pubs are obviously community hubs. They're great anti-loneliness machines. There's lots of reasons to cherish pubs. Do you think the government is doing enough in terms of pubs versus people buying beer in the supermarket and drinking at home?
In general, I've said that the tax differential between pubs and supermarkets will eventually erode the share of pubs. The typical person going out for a drink now, £5 a pint, going out for 2 or 3 pints in the evening, several nights a week, only a few can do that. So the tax differential is killing the pub habit to an extent.
Are we at the beginning of the long, slow decline and death of the pub?
Well, between when I started business in 1979 and pre-pandemic, the pub share of beer went from 90% to 50%, and supermarkets went to 50% from somewhere like 10. So,
wow.
So I'm not sure if that's a long, slow death, but it's a big increase in competition, mostly financed by taxes.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with this because pubs are so important to British culture, if I can put it that way. It's a very big issue. Do you think the pub industry, as it is, can survive another recession?
I think it'll survive in one way or another. I think it will thrive less than it has in the past, so long as there isn't equal taxes. And there's got the constant attritional pressure of a tax differential, which I think if you got rid of the tax differential, playing on a level playing field, I think pubs would increase as a percentage of the market.
So that's something that you would urge this government or any future government to look at really closely?
I'd say that's the number one thing to look at. It's rather esoteric. It's rather... When you walk into a pub, you can't see the tax you're paying on a pint, and publicans can't see it, and even directors of pub companies can't quite see it. But I think it's definitely true. It's the what we can see is the price differential now, and it is much bigger than it was 40 years ago.
Everybody at the moment, one way or another, is struggling with inflation and rising prices. And some of the big breweries are diluting the alcohol content of their beers to avoid these charges, these extra charges. There's the old song from the 1930s, I'm the man, the very fat man who waters the workers' beer. But I just wonder what your reaction is to the fact that your product, in many cases, is less strong than it was a few months ago.
Well, I think it's a crazy move, but again, it's financed by tax, because if you bring beer down to 3.4%, which is much lower than almost any beer you'd ever buy in a pub, you get a big tax break on the basis of the incredibly stupid reasoning that people will drink less alcohol if they drink weak beer. That's just not the way people are. So I think it's a bad idea. Brewers have jumped on the bandwagon. They can't resist the 25 pence tax break, but we are going to try and avoid doing it. Well, we won't. We might have to if we're sold a beer that's a lower gravity, but we want the proper strength beers.
You want the beers with a bit of kick in them.
Exactly.
But meanwhile, I mean, everything is going up. You know, the cost of electricity we know about. We're talking today on this show about the cost of mortgages going up. And, of course, a lot of pubs and hospitality businesses are quite heavily borrowed. Costs going up again and again and again. Some of your pubs were up to about a sort of £7 pint of beer, or pretty close. Are we heading eventually towards an £8 pint?
There are certainly some pubs that do that, and it's gone up more than you would imagine. Around the country, I go around the country visiting pubs and talking to our pub managers, whereas it's not a £5 in our pubs, it's a £5 in a lot of pubs, from Penzance to Wick at the moment. So, the price has gone up a hell of a lot. Will it go to £8? Quite probably, if things go on as they are.
And one day the 10 pint pound?
Andrew, there is no limit.
Because, again, it's the culture. I mean, I know there are European countries which have a different tradition and where a pint of beer or their equivalent costs a great deal more than it does here. And yet it has been so rooted, I say again, in our culture. And you may note a personal plea coming into this conversation or interview at the moment. But, you know, this is a country where people have gone and drunk beer. And if it carries on, it's going to go.
50% of people, I was reading, in the 1960s and 70s met their missus or their husband in the pub. So their pubs have got a lot to answer for. Most people would say maybe the price should go up then.
Alternatively, they might say if the price does go up, we will die out as a people.
We might.
Let me talk about Brexit, Tim, because if people think of the Brexit referendum, there's probably three faces they really remember. One is obviously Boris Johnson, one is Nigel Farage, and one is you.
Which is a double-edged sword.
A double-edged sword, I'm sure. Do you have any regrets? Regrets? I have a few.
I don't actually. I've been reading, since I knew I was coming on your show, I've been reading the Financial Times, which is quite pro-Remain, and I've been reading readers' comments, of which there are thousands, and I'm amazed the depth of emotion on this issue, but I don't think many people have changed their minds. I was brought up mostly in Northern Ireland, and you tend to be on one side of the fence or the other on the same issue. There's nothing, so it provokes something in the human soul. Are you going to be ruled from Dublin or London? And for most people around the world, they thought, well, why does anyone care? It's, you know, they're both democracies. And it's the same thing I think's happened in the UK. It's become very polarised. Have I regrets? No. I think for humanity to survive, I think we need democracy. We need democracy in China. We need democracy in Russia, especially in the nuclear age. And my bone to pick with the EU is you don't elect the president by universal suffrage. MEPs can't initiate legislation, and the ECJ, the court, isn't accountable to Parliament. So
it's a democratic issue, not an economic one.
I think the two things go together, which, you know, a lot of Remainers won't accept this. But I think the most powerful elixir for economics and for personal freedoms is democracy. And when you start reducing it, the level of economic performance eventually declines.
But don't you think back to the moment you were pulling pints with Boris Johnson and the things that were said about Brexit before and afterwards, and what has actually turned up? You know, food prices, far from going down, went up. We've had all sorts of trade frictions and so on, and the arguments about the 350 million. Don't you think that the way Brexit was sold and has been rolled out by successive governments has been, in the words of Mervyn King, who was sitting in that chair last week, a shambles?
I think democracy is always chaotic and shambolic. And I thought Boris, with his 8 years of running a magazine successfully, 8 years London mayor, would be a good administrator, etc. And I think he struggled with that side of the job far more than one could have imagined. So, but I think if you look around the world, you look at Britain between 1980 and now, real living standards doubled, as they did in the 30 years before that. And out of all the chaos, and wars, chaos, recessions, we're twice as well off. So strangely, democracy works.